Hey everyone, I've got a zipper skills video for you today. In this tutorial, we are going to be doing an inset or recessed zipper that has a tab at one end. This is different to a recessed zipper that is done with a panel. This one is sewn directly into the lining and it does not have a long tail. I'm going to be demonstrating on the Pythagorean pouch, but you can adapt this method to use on any bag pattern that you like. So let's get going. The first thing that we need to do is figure out exactly where we would like our zipper to sit in our finished bag so that we can cut our lining piece into two sections. Because of the seam allowance that we'll be using to install the zipper, you can't just cut your lining piece straight in half and then install your zipper, so you need to cut the top and the bottom sections separately. If you just cut along the lining section and then installed your zipper, then your lining section would end up being too short for your finished bag. So we're going to do this like we would do with color blocking. I'm doing the Pythagorean patch at 120%, but you can do this on whatever pattern you like. Because of the size of this finished bag, I'm going to have an upper section that is about 1.5 inches below the starting upper edge of the pattern. If you were doing it on a bigger bag, you may prefer to use something like 2 inches to get your measurement. I wouldn't go less than 1.5 inches. When I made a 100% size Pythagorean pouch, I used 1.25 inches and I found that it was just a little too shallow. So I'm going to have an upper section that is 1.5 inches tall. So I need to draw in the section for the top, the section for below the zipper, and make sure that I am including my seam allowances. So this first line is where the lower limit of my top piece will be. That is drawn 1.5 inches from the top of my pattern piece. I then need to add in a seam allowance for the lower section and a seam allowance for the upper section. So I want to have an overlap of 3/4 inch. So I'm going to draw a second line above the first line at 3/4 inch. So this lower section here, from the outermost line, this is the section that I'm going to cut from my lower lining, and this section from the top to 1.5 inches down is going to be the upper section. And you can see that I have an overlap of 3/4 inch, and that will create my seam allowance for the lower and the upper section. So that's the section where they will overlap. So if you took two pieces and you overlap the two of them, sew at your seam allowance of 3/8 inch. When it's folded out, you will lose the seam allowance from both pieces, which would put the seam at the center line here. So that is actually where the zipper will sit on my finished pouch. It'll sit in the middle of those two lines. You don't want to have it too high up because you are also going to have a seam allowance at the top here. So once the bag is finished being sewn, the top of the bag will sit here. This will be the recessed section. That's where my zipper sits, and this is the lower half of my bag. So you can decide where you want that to sit based on what you want your finished pouch to look like, or whatever bag it is that you're doing this on. So what I now need to do is cut my lining pieces. This piece was cut from the full pattern piece, so I just need to cut the top section off. Now you can trim this down and then cut it off that way. You can fold it under, you can print a second pattern piece. I am just going to take that measurement, which is 3/4 inch down from the upper edge, and trim that off both of my lining pieces to create the lower half of my lining. What you then need to do is cut the top section. You can cut your top section from the same material as you used for your lining. I have cut mine from my exterior fabric. This piece is already cut, and you can see that it fits this section from the upper limit of my pattern down to that line that we drew. That is where I would cut it. You can make that pattern piece separate if you like. You can use parchment paper. You're doing this pretty much like you would if you were going to do color blocking. So now I have my two pattern pieces, the upper section and the lower section. So the lower half of my lining is cut from this bottom section here, and the upper part is cut from this top section. And we can double check that by laying our pattern pieces onto the lining pattern piece, and they should overlap by 3/4 of an inch, which is double the seam allowance, which they do. So when we're finished, the zipper is going to sit here. Do that for both sides of your lining. So we now have 2 upper lining sections and 2 lower lining sections, and now we need to measure our zipper. When you are measuring the finished size of your zipper tape, you want to consider that at the end of the zipper tape, the bag sides are going to have to fold around the end tab on your zipper, so you don't want it to be too close to the ends. I like to use a measurement that is 2 inches shorter than the width of the bag at this upper limit. So measure the upper limit of the lower half of your pattern piece. Mine is just over 8.5 inches. So I want my finished zipper length to be just over 6.5 inches. To make sure that I'm getting that measurement as exact as possible, I'm going to turn the ends out first, then trim it to size and apply my zipper tab. Turn your zipper teeth out 90 degrees using whatever your preferred method is. I like to pinch my tape in half, fold the coils out to the side, and then you can either hand sew or use a lighter to melt the ends of that zipper tape. I'm going to clip that in place. Some people like to use a sewing machine also when they turn out the open end of their zipper. I find it a little tricky to do on my sewing machine, so I tend to either hand sew or use a lighter just to melt it into place. Make sure that the turns are matched up on both sides, and then secure that turn. Check that the turn is even. And now I'm going to measure my zipper tape. Place your pull if you haven't already. I want it to be 2 inches shorter than this upper section. So you can measure with your ruler, you can measure using your cutting mat, and then trim your zipper to size. I always use different scissors, not my fabric scissors, for trimming my zipper. And then check that it is about 1 inch shorter from either end, from the coils to the end of your tape. And that's about right. And now we can attach our tab. I like to cinch the end of my zipper tape with my lighter. Then take a tab piece. This is a scrap of my exterior fabric that is cut to 2 inches by 1.5 inches. And I'm going to fold the short edges together with the wrong side in. Increase the fold. I'm then going to open it back out and fold the short edges in to meet the fold, again wrong sides together, creating a double fold tab that encloses the short raw ends. Then with your zipper pull in place, you're going to wrap that around the closed end of your zipper, and I'm then going to sew this in place over the end of my zipper tape. I'm going to start my stitches in the side seam of the zipper tab, pivot and sew across this side, being careful of the zipper teeth, and turn and sew the other side of the tab. Using a longer stitch length and a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch. Trim any threads, and you can also trim that tab to be flush with the edge of your zipper tape. And I like to double check that I am happy with the length of my zipper compared to the size of my lining panel, and that is good. So what I'm now going to do is mark the center of my lower lining sections, my upper lining sections, and my zipper tape. And when I'm marking the center of my zipper tape, I am lining up the edge of the coil with the fold on my tab to get the center. You can mark that with a pen, or you can use scissors to make a tiny snip. The way that we're installing the zipper is very similar to how we did the zipper installation in the open end 90-degree turned zipper from the first Zipper Skills video that I did. I like to use double-sided tape for my zipper installs. You can use clips or pins if that is your preference. I'm going to place a strip of double-sided tape along the upper edge of the lower lining panels and along the lower edge of the upper lining panels. And then starting first with my back panel, I'm going to place my zipper tape so that it is wrong sides down. That is the side that has the back of the zipper pull and without the visible zipper tape, facing that back sides down on the lower lining section, lining up the center. Remove the backing from the double-sided tape, line up the center mark, and lining up the raw edges, pressing that down. And the space beyond your zipper coil at this end and the folded zipper tab at the other end should be approximately even. Take your upper lining section and place that right sides down on the zipper tape and press that in place. And there will be some overhang at the side if your pattern piece is angled like mine is, and that's because of the seam allowance overlap. So that is supposed to be like that. That is why we mark the centers. I'm going to slide my zipper pull out of the way to make sure that I'm getting it nice and straight. Press it down around the coils so there's no gaps. Smooth it in place. So you can see here I have lining, upper section, zipper tape, zipper pull is on, tab is on. We have the fold in this end, and then I have my lower section of my lining. And I'm going to be sewing from one end to the other end using a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. 3/8 of an inch is the excess that I used for my upper and lower lining sections, and that is the seam allowance that I'm going to be using for my zipper install. I like to use a zipper foot. I've got a shorter stitch length selected. I'm back stitching at the beginning, starting at the very edge, sewing along, and when I come to the coils there, I have my hump jumper just to help me get over the bulk. Continue all the way along, slide the pull as you need to so that you get a nice straight line. Coming up to the tab, use your hump jumper again if you need to. Make sure that the lining is nicely tucked around your tab. You can use a stiletto or whatever you have handy to make sure that that is nicely tucked up there. Come all the way to the end. Your stitch line should be approximately where the lining upper and lining lower sections are overlapping. Smooth the upper section away from the zipper teeth, and now we are going to install the zipper on the second side of the lining. Flip that around and take the lower lining section, remove the backing from that double-sided tape, and line up the center of that zipper with the center of that lower lining piece. Take the second upper lining piece and you're going to sandwich the zipper tape between the upper and lower sections. So you've got zipper teeth side up, upper lining section is right sides down, matching up the center markings, and press that in place all the way along, the same way as we did on the first side. And we will be sewing through the upper lining section, the zipper tape, and the lower lining section, and we have the right side of the upper lining section face down on the zipper teeth, and below that we have the back of the zipper facing the lower lining section. And we're going to be sewing all the way from one end to the other. The other thing that I like to check is that the lower edge of my lining pieces are fairly well aligned so that I don't end up with a wonky zipper. Sewing along here at 3/8 of an inch. Slide the zipper pull out of the way so that you can keep a nice straight line. And as you come up to your zipper teeth, use a hump jumper if you need to, and make sure that you are hugging the fabric around those teeth so you don't get any gaps in your seam. A couple of reinforcing stitches at that coil can be helpful if that's a high stress point. A back stitch at the end. When you've sewn the zipper to both sides of that lining, check that you're happy with the spacing on either side of the teeth and with how well lined up the ends of your zipper are. When you're happy, we can top stitch that zipper. You can choose to top stitch above the zipper, or you can top stitch below the zipper tape, whatever your preference is. If you choose to top stitch below the zipper tape, that will cause the zipper to pop up a little like this. If you choose to sew above it, then it is going to sink a little more down into your pouch because of where your seam allowance will sit. So if you are going to top stitch above, the seam allowance will be pointed towards the top of the bag. If you're going to top stitch below, the seam allowance will be pointed towards the lower part of the bag, and the zipper teeth will go the opposite direction to the way that that seam has been folded. For this one, I think I'm going to sew below my zipper tape. There's no particular reason to do it one way or the other. The reason that I'm going to sew underneath, which is on this side of the tape, is so that on my finished pouch, my zipper is going to sit up a little more, and that may just make it slightly easier to get into the pouch. But it's personal preference, so you can do it however you like. You can choose, if you wish, to place double-sided tape within this seam allowance, and that will allow you to smooth that lining away from the zipper. The other benefit of doing it this way is that you will definitely keep your lining out of your zipper teeth, which I know a lot of people like to do. So I'm going to sew along this edge. I'm keeping my double-sided tape outside of my 1/8 of an inch top stitching seam allowance, right at the very edge of my lining material. Smooth that out down here. And the other thing that I'm going to do is just trim the very corner here of that seam allowance to reduce the bulk in the side seam when I finish sewing up my pouch. So I'm just trimming the very corner of that seam allowance there. So we have the upper lining section that I'm going to press away from my zipper teeth with the zipper installed. And we have the lower lining section that I have pressed away from my zipper teeth and also secured with double-sided tape within the seam allowance out of the top stitching line. And what I'm going to do is sew along this edge, sewing through the lower lining piece and this seam allowance, but keeping the upper lining section clear. And then I'll flip everything over, and I'll be doing the same thing on this side. Again, sewing through the lining, the seam allowance, but not the upper lining section. So this part will not have any top stitching on it. That'll be up out of the way, sewing just below my zipper tape. If you prefer, you can flip your seam the other way, like we talked about. That would look like this, pushed up towards the top of the bag, and then you would sew along this edge, keep the lining out of the way, and sew all the way along through the upper section, the seam allowance, but not the lining section. So you can choose which of those you want to do. I have switched back to my regular zipper foot. I'm using a longer stitch length and a seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch, starting my top stitching in the side seam where I can back stitch to secure my threads, pivot, and sew along below my zipper tape. Making sure that the upper lining section is clear of my stitch line, sewing through the lining and the seam allowance from that zipper install. And when I come up to my zipper pull, I'm going to slide it out of the way. And then I'll continue along. And when I get to the other end of my seam, I'm going to pivot again and back stitch within the seam allowance. So you can see that that top stitching line is pushing the zipper towards the upper part of the lining panel. I'm going to flip it around and do the same on the other side. Keep the first side well out of the way. Slide the zipper pull as you come to it. stitch at the other end and finish up. That zipper is now installed in my lining piece, so I can finish sewing up my bag. Depending on the style of bag that you have done this method of zipper installation in, you may or may not be able to complete the construction of your bag the way the pattern was written. For this particular pouch, I can still attach the lining upper edge to the exterior upper edge on both sides, and then sew the side seams together once that's all joined up. Or you can sew the side seams and the bottom seam of the exterior and then nest one inside the other and birth it that way, sewing around the upper limit, kind of like you would with a tote bag. What you could also do, because you already have your zipper installed, is convert it to a drop-in lining, in which case you would sew the lower edges and the same on the exterior, and then you would fold over the top and then put the lining inside of your exterior and sew around the outside. I'm going to sew this as I normally would, the only difference being that my linings are already joined in the middle and I don't need to install my zipper. But you can do it essentially the same way. You can mark your centers to line that up. I'm going to clip along the upper edge. I'm going to sew along that edge at 3/8 of an inch, and then the other side, lining up the exterior with the lining upper section. So I'm going to sew along here at 3/8 of an inch and also along here at 3/8 of an inch. So I have my two exterior panels, and this is my lining piece here in the center. Using my shorter stitch length, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. Because we've changed the way that we're putting together this Pythagorean pouch by moving where the zipper is, you do have options for how you want to do your top stitching, the same way as you can change up how you do construction, either by doing it as a drop-in lining, or you could sew the sides of your bag together and then nest the lining inside of the exterior and sew the top seam that way. You can also change up how you're doing your top stitching. You can choose to do your top stitching the way the original pattern was written. You can choose to butterfly your seam and do your top stitching. You can top stitch at the end. For simplicity, I'm going to follow along with the way the original pattern was written, but it is certainly something that you can experiment with and change up how you are finishing up your bag and doing your top stitching. So I am going to top stitch just along the upper edge of this zipper pouch. I'm going to fold the seam allowance of my lining underneath my exterior, and I'm going to press that down, and I will be top stitching through this seam allowance and my exterior, leaving this lining panel out of the way. You can, the same way as we did with the lining, use double-sided tape to keep that nicely smoothed out. I'm going to start my back stitching in the side, sew along this edge and back stitch again, and I will do the same thing on the other side, making sure that I'm keeping my lining panel up out of the way, only sewing through the exterior and the seam allowance the same way as you would if you were sewing all the way along next to a zipper. Longer stitch length and a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And do the same thing for the other side. So those two seams are top stitched, and then similarly to how we would have it if we had installed a zipper here, we have our exterior and our linings. So we can clip around the outside and sew all the way around, and then we will turn the bag out through the lining and close it up. Because we have the extra seam here in the lining, I'm going to be extra careful when I'm lining it up to make sure that my lining join is matched up at the side. I also want to make sure that my upper edge is matched up. I'm going to place staples in those two sections and then clip around the rest of my pouch. So just placing a staple within the seam allowance so that I can get those upper edges to be well lined up, and also within the seam allowance where the upper and lower sections of the lining are joined together. And now I'm going to sew around the entire outside of my pouch. Starting in the bottom of the lining, I'm going to sew away from the opening, back stitch, and then come further along so that my tails are not within the opening of the lining. Back stitch again when I get to the corner. I like to backstitch at my boxed corners because I like to have that extra reinforcement. I find if I don't backstitch, it can create a weak point in that seam. Come up to the join, careful of where I've placed my staple and careful of the bulk from the layers. A couple of extra stitches to reinforce there. And I'm sewing straight up to where the top seam is, stopping at the line where I've sewn. And then I'm going to pivot and come down this side, again being careful of that staple. Coming up to the top again, sewing up to the line. You're looking for your shorter stitches, not your top stitching line, and that is where you're going to pivot. You can reinforce that point there also. And then you're going to pivot to come down the other side. I've got a little bit of bulk here from my zipper tab. I'm just going to press that down, but there's plenty of space there to get past. Last section of the lining, coming back up to that turning hole, and I'm going to back stitch but finish up further away from the opening so that there's no loose threads in that opening. I'm leaving an opening of about 3.5 inches. Depending on your materials, you may need a wider opening. Now I'm going to box my corners, opening out the lining and the exterior. You can choose to push your seams to one side and the other, or to butterfly those open. And then we're just going to sew along those box corners again at 3/8 of an inch, just following along with the rest of the regular construction of this style of pouch. I like to make sure that my lower seam is pointing the same way so you don't get any twisting. Make sure that your zipper is open as well if you haven't already. I also like to make sure that my exterior and lining, if I'm pushing to one side, are pushed to the opposite sides so that the bulk is more spread out. And then just boxing all of those corners. Trim your threads and remove any staples that you placed in construction. And I also like to trim back this corner at the upper edge because it will be a little bulkier without having the zipper there. So I'm just going to trim that back a little, just at the junction between the exterior and the lining. And now we can turn our pouch out through the opening. And we're going to poke out the corner at the very top, roll the upper edge down, You can, if you like, place double-sided tape within the seam allowance on the inside to help keep that lining down. You can also pin the corners together to keep it down. I'm just going to press mine, and that should keep that lining out of the way. So you do have the option of top stitching at this last step here, which would also keep that lining down, but it does get a little tricky around this corner here. Close up your zipper. And there you can see you have your inset or recessed zipper without the zipper panel. I haven't closed up my lining yet, but I will get to that. You can close it on your sewing machine. You can hand sew it closed. I'm going to press that here to make it sit nice and flat, and then it's all finished. So you can see that just gives you an alternative way to finish off your patch, gives it a different look. Nice, neat top of your bag, and you can adapt that for whatever pattern you like. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.